Okay. So again, for those of you that just came, this workshop is on APIs. So we're going to kind of dive into what APIs are, how you can use them, and how these might be helpful for you at HackNC this weekend. So we'll kind of be just covering a lot of the basic stuff, show some examples in Python code. And we have this notebook for you guys to follow along if you want to. So I'll kind of first start off by showing how you can follow along. So if you're interested, you can go to our GitHub here. The link is right here up top. It's just github.com/Carolina Data Science /API workshop. So if you navigate there, you'll see all the files that you'll need for this workshop. So I'll give you guys a couple minutes to do that and let us know if you have any problems finding that. Show of hands, has anyone been able to get to that? Okay. So once you're there, I'd say the easiest way to kind of follow along is to use something called Google Colab. So that will let you open up this Python notebook just in your browser. So if you go to colab.research.google.com, you will be taken to something that's pretty similar to this landing page. You can navigate to the GitHub tab on the left here, and then just copy and paste the link of our GitHub into here. And if you do that, you'll see the notebook right here. You can just click on it and open it up like that. So that was a couple different steps. I'll let you guys take a couple minutes to do that. Yeah, let me know if you guys have any questions or problems with that. Yeah, so were you able to pull up a GitHub? I think this is a... I just don't know where to go. Oh, that's sorry. I have to. Oh, sorry. This is a quick link. Sorry. Okay. All right. Can I get just like a show of hands if that's what for people? All good. Any questions or any problems pulling that up? Okay, so we'll get into it now. So yeah, feel free to follow along as we kind of go through these different things. We have some information and then also some examples in code. So this can kind of serve as a resource for you guys later as well. But just starting off, does anyone have an idea of what an API is, or have you guys used APIs in the past? Any answers are okay. Yeah.
Well, it's sort of like it's almost like a connector that you can grab onto with your program and send stuff to and get stuff from.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great definition. Has anyone used an API in the past, or maybe had an example of APIs? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, well, I made a website one time, and I used the Rick and Morty API. It was like a Rick and Morty character search. It's like a silly website, and I used the API to like pull all the information on each character and like an image of them.
Awesome. Yeah. So that's a great example of an API that kind of serves you data. So that's kind of going to be the focus of our workshop today. There are also other APIs where you might be able to kind of interact with the service. So think of like ChatGPT has an API to interact with OpenAI and kind of make different queries. You can also send, we'll kind of talk about this later, but there are a couple different like operations that you can perform with an API. The main focus of our workshop is going to be APIs that are kind of just serving you data. And we'll be trying to use that data and pull that into our code. But as you guys work on your projects at HackNC, again, like the Rick and Morty example, you might want to be pulling in data dynamically, not just having it hard coded. So APIs are a great way to get this data from other parties and kind of integrate them into your applications pretty easily. So that's kind of the motivation for why we want to use APIs and why they might be useful for HackNC. So the first way that we'll go about looking at APIs is using API wrappers. So API wrappers are basically libraries that kind of have pre-built functionality for specific APIs. So these are really great for just kind of getting started really quickly. They have different methods that people have already created to allow you to easily do things like get data, authenticate your API, and stuff like that. So if there is an API wrapper for the API you want to use, that can be a great option to use it very easily. But there's not always wrappers for API. Someone has to kind of build these. But the first example we'll look at is an example of an API with a wrapper. So this is a very simple API. It's called the Python Weather API. Basically, it just gives you different weather information for location at a specific time. So the first thing that we want to do when installing the wrapper is we just want to install it with pip. So that'll be the first step that you'll see there. This is just installing the wrapper so that we can make use of those pre-built functions. So yeah, if you just run that line there, you should be able to install it. So yeah, that shouldn't take too long to install that. And then you'll just want to import it here with the second line. And finally, you will just want to kind of initialize your API with a client. So this is kind of like how you'll just make that initial setup. But when you do this here, you'll pass in a couple parameters to initialize it. So here we're passing in like the specific type of units that we want to use. So we're using imperial units. Sometimes when you're initializing APIs through wrappers, you might have to pass in some sort of like API key. So a lot of APIs actually require something like authentication or a key to prove that you have access to the API. So this API is free for everyone. There are tons of APIs that are free, but there are also APIs that you might have to pay for. Like the OpenAI API that I talked about earlier. So that's kind of one thing to keep in mind. You can't just use all APIs for free, but you might have to authenticate when using API. So yeah, that's how you'll set it up. And then to get some data, we can use the get command that this wrapper has. So we want to get data on Chapel Hill's weather. So it's, as you can see, it's very simple. You're just using the client that you've created and you're calling a command get, and then you're just passing in the city that you want. So Chapel Hill in this case. So that'll return the weather in the object format, and then from here we can kind of parse through the different information that it's returning. So I'll give you guys a couple of seconds to look at that, and kind of don't worry if like this code doesn't look like exactly intuitive at first. All API wrappers and APIs are going to work a little bit differently. There's no way to kind of know how an API will work before using it. So you really just have to kind of look at the documentation online. Usually it's pretty clear cut, but they'll give you different functions that you can use, what you have to pass in, and what will be returned. So This will be kind of different for different APIs, but as long as you kind of understand the general format of how to retrieve data, that you should be able to. So with that, we've gotten our weather object back. If you print it here, you'll see that we have this object. You can see some of the information that's returned from it. You can see that we have temperature 74 degrees. So I think I ran this a couple minutes ago, but if you check the temperature for Chapel Hill right now, it should be around that. It's partly cloudy, and we have a location as well for Chapel Hill. So again, this is stored in kind of an object format, so you might want to parse out specific pieces of this. For example, if you want the current weather, the current temperature, you can use this code to kind of parse through the different data that was returned. And you can kind of see that structure in this object here. You can see that it has this current field, which has another object within it for the current forecast. And then if you go through that, you can access another field for the temperature. So again, this is kind of the specific format for this Python weather wrapper, but many different wrappers will also use the same kind of system of storing things in objects, and there might be nested objects, but documentation should make it pretty clear on how to access the data from these from whatever's returned. So that's kind of some basic information on how to get the temperature. There's also a forecast property in this weather API that returns the forecasted temperature for like the next couple of days. So we can see that if we access this weather forecast property, we can loop through that just using a simple loop, and we'll access some of the data within that, like the date, the forecasted temperature, and the moon phase that is projected. So this is just how we can, this kind of shows like what we returned from that data. It's just for the next couple of days, the projected, I think, average temperature and moon phase. But again, this is a really simple API that has a wrapper for it. So this is kind of the easiest way to access an API. And as you can see, you can get a lot of real-time data very easily into your application, just literally like 2 or 3 lines of code. So any questions on this example on what API wrappers are, anything like that? Yeah, go ahead.
So what exactly does the wrapper do?
Yeah, so the wrapper, we'll kind of see this in the next example as well, where we'll go through an API that we're not using a wrapper, but the wrapper basically builds like predefined functionality for you to access the different attributes. So basically using an API directly is kind of using it in its raw form, but a wrapper kind of has things built on top of that just to make it easier to access. Makes it easier to access. And I think a wrapper, you know, in this form, since this API is so simple, it might be a little hard to understand like the benefits. But if you can imagine an API where you might have to, like, you know, pass in authentication, you might have to update data or send different requests like that. It might be a little harder to do that just in its raw form, but wrappers kind of build on different functions on top to make those common operations like very easy. So yeah, hopefully that helps. Okay, yeah, so yeah, concluding from that, it was pretty simple to use the wrapper, but as I kind of said earlier, wrappers are not always available for an API, so sometimes we need to kind of use those APIs manually. And for that example, we'll be using a Pokemon API. This API actually does have a wrapper for it as well, but we'll try to use it without the wrapper just to show you guys how you can use it manually. And before we kind of get into that, we'll just go over a couple of different common methods that APIs use. So these 5 here are kind of the most common ones. We saw the GET request earlier. That's usually to get some sort of information from the API. Post is usually to send some new information to the API. Put is to update something in the API. Patch is probably less common. It says to partially update an existing resource, so yeah, this is kind of less common, but delete is also pretty common. It's just to delete a resource in the API. So the most common one that you guys are going to be seeing, especially for just retrieving data, is going to be the get request. But if you guys are, say, interacting with some sort of like database that you have access to, you might want to say like post different things that you have, or delete or update things as necessary. But for most APIs that we'll be working with, that you guys will probably be working with, it'll probably just usually be a get request. So to use an API in its kind of raw form, there's a couple things that you need to know. So an API kind of, as we said earlier, you know, we're interacting with some sort of other party that's there. So that party is kind of pushing the information that it has access to a URL. So we're kind of basically going to that URL and we're going to get the information that was posted there. So for the Pokemon API, we can see that we want to get information about a specific Pokemon, say Charizard. All of that information from the Poke API is actually stored at this link here. So if we just copy and paste that into Google, you can see that this is all the information that's kind of returned from the API. So as you can imagine, this is not super useful to just kind of see all of this. There's a ton of information here, but it's not very easy to parse through. It's not really easy to understand what's in here and what information we can extract from this. So we kind of need better ways to do this. But yeah, and if you noticed earlier, all of this data is actually in a JSON format. So that's kind of a common way of storing data. Again, it's not really very visually appealing here, but it is a way to store data that makes parsing very easy when we work with it later on. So so yeah, that is basically the data that we'll be working with, that we'll be getting from the API. But now we'll do this in code. So to use APIs in code, you need one really important library when working in Python. At least you need the requests library. This basically allows you to just pass in a URL and then get that information back, like we kind of just saw. So you're just going to install requests and import that if you don't already have it. Again, you can do that with these commands right here pretty easily. And then with requests, you can see here, we just want to again request for this URL that we just looked at. This is the same one that we just opened up in the browser. And we're going to just use the request get command to get the information from that URL. So again, this is a get request that we kind of just talked about earlier. So when we do that, we'll see that it is stored in a variable that we're calling response. So this is what's returned to us from our request. And we can see that, again, like we opened up in the browser, we're getting a lot of this same information back. We're looking at response, then we're calling the JSON command on it, which is just showing us all of the information that was returned in JSON form. Here it's displayed a little bit nicer, but you can still see it's a lot of data, very overwhelming. But there is a lot of useful stuff here. So yeah, and I guess just a quick recap of JSON format for those of you guys that might not be familiar. JSON basically stores things as keys and values. So if you look up something in this format, you can see that there are a lot of different keys. We see base happiness, capture rate, color, egg groups, etc. And corresponding with each of those keys, we have values. So for Charizard's information, we see that his base happiness has a value of 50. So sometimes the corresponding values are kind of as simple as that, just numbers. Sometimes they can be something more complicated, like another JSON format. So here we have color, and the corresponding value with color is a whole nother kind of dictionary of items. So we can see within color, we have more keys and values, things like name, URL, etc. So it can kind of follow that nested structure. But the important thing to keep in mind is that you have keys and values to look up by, and that's kind of how you'll be parsing through all of this information. So if you've used like a dictionary in Python, it's the same exact idea, or like a hash map. It's that same type of data structure. So again, we'll move past all of this, this huge response. And again, kind of how we talked about earlier, this is how we will parse through those keys and values in Python. So if we want to see what Pokemon cards are evolved from, we can go to this evolves from species key, and that will give us another dictionary. I'll try to see if I can find it up here. Okay, yeah. So if you guys can see, this evolves from species key. So we went into that key. We see that the output is another dictionary. So from that, we can look at the name key, which is right there as well. And then we can kind of find our answer at the end. So that's just a basic example of how we can, parse through all that data and find our kind of final output. But we can also do, we can find other information through that same kind of process as well. This is another example, just using our same keys and values. In this example, one of the values at one point is the list, so that's also valid. But we're finding like the 10th entry in that list or 11th entry, and we're extracting from there. So again, this hopefully makes a little bit of more sense right now, but another question you guys might have is that obviously, it's pretty easy to look up these keys and values, but how do we really know, what keys are there and what values are there without, looking through this massive amount of information that's returned? So again, the best answer for that is really just looking at the documentation. So if we go to the website for this API, we can see that there's pretty extensive documentation on what information is returned for each of these Pokemon. So this is really the best way to kind of figure out what data is returned. If it has the data that you need, it might not, but you can kind of see like each individual field that's returned here, the structure of it, kind of how it's formatted, all of that information that you might need to parse it through. So yeah, you can see there's a lot of detailed information here. This is pretty common among most well-documented APIs. And this one also has descriptions on what each of those keys mean. So, by the key name, it might not be too obvious, but if you really look at the documentation, that'll kind of give you a better description. This one also tells you the data type that's involved as well. So, yeah, I think that's really definitely an important part of working with APIs, is just understanding that you'll have to really understand how to look at documentation. And say if you're developing an API too, you really want to always make sure that you're documenting everything well, documenting the format of requests and also the data that is returned. So, yeah, that is the main code example for our workshop. Again, it's super simple. Even if it doesn't look simple right now, hopefully if you guys kind of give it some more time, look at it, it might get there for you. But with just very few lines of code, you can really get dynamic information into your application for any workshop or for any kind of category that you guys might have. This year for HackNC, the theme is Tech or Treat, or there's kind of a haunted theme with Halloween coming up. So to get you guys started on that path, we wanted to give you guys some time to maybe look at or look for different APIs that might relate to this theme that you guys might use for your work, for your projects this weekend. So the first person that can find a Halloween related or API that relates to one of these, or what the theme for HackNC, will actually get a HackNC tote bag, or not tote bag, fanny pack from last year. So yeah, go ahead and take some time to kind of look online, see what there is. For some inspiration, we did also link a list of APIs to get started. So that just has a list of a lot of different APIs you can use. And I think at HackNC, you definitely don't have to use something Halloween related, but so this list of public APIs might also be helpful for you guys over the weekend if you take that route. So yeah, take some time to look for different APIs, just see what's out there. If you find something, raise your hand and I'll kind of confirm if it passes. And also, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or come up. And yeah, we hope you guys enjoy this workshop. AJ, if you want to just talk about CADS, I guess, for a couple of minutes for people that aren't familiar. But yeah.
Sure. So, yes, thank you, Amit, for doing a great job introducing APIs to everybody. As you all will be working throughout your HackNC project.